this. See if it fits my oversized head. Nope. I gotta have some padding in here. That's the thing.
That's the main problem with the Greek helmet.
You just can't see
They're
anything.
all just too big. Hello, I'm Tristan Hughes. I'm the host of the Ancients podcast and here for another YouTube video. Today I'm joined by my good friend and YouTube sensation, Dr. Roel Konijnendijk. Roel, how are you?
I'm well, thanks. Great to be here.
Yeah, and this is interesting. It's a completely new format. We are the test dummies for it, but it's a head-to-head history round and it's the Roman legionary soldier versus the Greek hoplite. Are you ready?
Yes, let's go. Let's do it.
Weapons. I've picked it up. Would you like to talk first of all about the weapons of a classical Greek hoplite?
Of course. So the classical Greek hoplite is kind of an iconic figure. I mean, you've probably all seen the image. The hoplite here, I mean, this is basically the fully armored hoplite figure that you get. So he's got a long spear. He's got a big round shield that's a double grip shield, so he's got his arm stuck into an elbow grip. It's about sort of 90 centimeters in diameter, and you have to imagine as well, like, these people are not like my extreme Dutch height, but like, you know, they would have been covered very significantly by a shield of that size. And then their offensive weapons, they are this very long spear, which, you know, it varied in length. It didn't have a standard length. It's not like they sort of took out a tape measure and said, this is how long it's going to be. Somewhere between 2 meters and maybe 3, maybe even a little bit more.
Yeah. And do they hold it like 3/4 of the way down the shaft? Is that the usual? Or?
Yeah, so what you're seeing in this image is pretty much the idea. So it's balanced towards the rear, which is what the counterweight helps to achieve. So this little thing here is called sarater, sometimes a lizarder or lizard killer, because you presumably, because you stab it in the ground, sometimes something gets caught in there. But fundamentally, it moves the point of balance further to the rear, which means that you have more reach to the front, basically. You can use more of that shaft to stab ahead of you rather than having to balance it in the middle. And then the other weapon that they carry is a short sword, which you can see sort of tucked away here in the shield. There are two main types they use. One is the siphos, which is a sort of straight leaf-shaped sword, very similar to the Roman one. And the other is called kopis or makaira, which is more of a sort of axe dressed up as a sword. It's a slashing weapon, yeah. It's a recurved saber, so it leans forward, has most of its weight towards the tip. It's a very heavy weapon. It was prized for fighting on horseback because you can slash down with it very easily, but also in infantry combat it's very, very effective. It puts a lot of weight towards the tip of the blade, so you can crash through armor, you can break helmets, things like that.
I mean, that's a two-edged sword as well, isn't it?
That's right.
So it can slash either way or stab. Yeah.
So the siphos is for stabbing and slashing and, you know, whatever you want to do with it. It's quite short, but it does have the two edges, whereas the kopis or makaira has only a single edge.
Right, well, moving on to the classic Roman legionary, and I believe I've got one here, absolutely, yes. The classic image you do have of a Roman legionary soldier from the early imperial period, so from about like kind of 1 AD, 1 CE, kind of that area just before, all the way for the next couple of centuries or so. But the main weapon, I mean, let's talk about the sword first of all, because that's the weapon you think of first and foremost. The short stabbing sword, which you can see on the side here, in a lovely little scabbard as well. I'll talk about the scabbard in a bit later too. But the short stabbing sword called a gladius. Now, earlier than the imperial period, the Roman legionary soldiers still did have like a short stabbing sword, but it was a bit longer. It gets a bit shorter by this time. And there are various different styles or different patterns to the gladius. So overall, it kind of retained the same purpose, like kind of mainly for thrusting and stabbing, but you get different patterns. Like there's the Mainz pattern blade, which is kind of, it gets narrower in the middle and then bulges out and then into kind of a triangular tip. But then you get ones like the Pompey style blade, which is more kind of parallel all the way. But that was the main weapon of each Roman legionary soldier. Of course, we must also mention though the javelin, the pilum, which is also the thing that is very associated with a Roman legionary soldier, but there's also a lot of debate around so many different parts of the Roman pilum. I mean, how many did a Roman legionary have? Was it one? Was it two? Some even argue that they may have had 3 javelins at 2. Did it bend in the middle when it struck an enemy? And another one regarding, were there differences in the design? But the Roman javelin was used by Roman legionary normally at the start of a battle before engaging in close combat. And it's designed, you have the long wooden shaft, then you have this iron shank, and then you have this kind of diamond-shaped tip. Both of those main weapons, psychologically on the battlefield, they were terrifying.
Yeah, it's worth saying about the pilum actually that compared to other javelins of the ancient world, it's really quite a heavy and very carefully designed weapon. Like most javelins in antiquity are basically just a stick with a small sort of metal point. It doesn't have the same counterweight, it doesn't have that whole mechanism of a long iron shaft that's sort of locked into it. So this is built for a specific purpose, which has been speculated about. The ancient authors will say that it's because of this attempt to kind of get stuck in someone's armor, disable shields, things like that. We don't really know, but like Greeks obviously also used javelins, infantry and cavalry both, but they were of a much simpler design. Yeah. They did have a throwing loop to sort of go further and fly more accurately. But otherwise, they didn't have this kind of level of design to try and fit a specific role on the battlefield. So they're really just much more like, see what you can do with it.
And it's a really interesting design. And we've been saying we're using the word javelin quite a lot for the pilum, but we should also stress that actually, like if a Roman soldier was in a bit of a pinch, they could use the pilum as a spear. It gives you a bit extra reach as well, so kind of like the Greek hoplite. So it could be used, but usually when we hear about the pilum being used, it's at the start of the battle, it's being thrown, and then the Romans will charge in with their large scutum shield and their sword, their gladius sword, and kind of basically be a battering ram of kind of moving forwards, hitting them with the boss of the shield, then stabbing with the gladius, moving forwards, and that kind of battering ram motion. One thing you can't see on this image would be the other kind of melee weapon that they would be using, which would be a pugio dagger, which is much smaller than the gladius, but kind of similar in the design that, kind of have that triangular tip. And like with the gladius, it was designed, it didn't need to go deep into an enemy, but of course horrific wounds, hemorrhaging. It was another psychologically terrifying weapon. And I think there's also examples of legionaries going into battle in special cases with their pugios. In assassination of Julius Caesar, those assassins, you can imagine them smuggling in, kind of hiding pugios in their togas, and that's how they did away with Julius Caesar. And I guess you could say the scutum shield, although we see it as armour, it is also a weapon in its own right, like I guess the hoplite shield, because it has this big iron boss in the middle that, if you hit an enemy with it, you could break their nose. It's got iron and some of the rims of the curved rectangular shield as well, that if you hit an enemy's foot with it as well, it could cause big damage.
Can't do that with a hoplite shield. It won't go that far.
But can the hoplite shield, can it also be used as an offensive?
You absolutely would use it that way. It's always depicted that way. Hoplites are always depicted essentially protecting themselves by raising this thing up to make a sort of glacis, right? To make a sort of slanted armor. But obviously you can try to use that also to try and do a shield bash, I guess, with the side. But this is something that's debated among reenactors, because some of them have tried it. They say you can't do it. Others will say, oh, you're too tight in this formation to be able to use that effectively. It is much more of a defensive weapon, I think, than the scutum, which has this sort of attested sort of practice of being used as a way to fight, as a way to drive the enemy.
It's two different kind of uses of weapons, isn't it? There's no getting away from the Roman imperial soldier like this being like the best and most feared unit, I would say, at the time on the military battlefield. But
unless they meet an elephant. Yeah.
Well, yes, exactly. But what would you say about it? It's two different types of weapons, main weapons, whereas the Roman legion soldier is using a sword, which feels quite different to so many years previously. Absolutely. In ancient warfare, where the spear is the main weapon of choice. The
spear is king, right? That's the kind of idea that you get. And it's important to note, as you say, about the psychology of facing these weapons, of encountering them. They have the expression, obviously, we take conquered by the sword. Their phrase is aik malotos, conquered by the spear. Yeah. Right? Taken by the spear is their expression for conquest. So the spear is the sort of iconic weapon that you would use. And when they talk about the danger of battle, metaphorically, they can talk about a storm of spears. They can talk about what you do in battle is face the spears. That is essentially the function of an infantryman. And so in that sense, like the psychology of it is really all deciding. It's like, which weapon do you think is the most sort of awe-inspiring, essentially? Which weapon do you think of as the default? If you were to grab any weapon and fight, what is it that you go for? In the Greek mind, this is absolutely going to be these long spears, because that is how you can inflict terrible wounds while staying at a safe distance.
But that is also the thing. I remember talking to a reenactor, but also someone who works at the Kalkriese Museum in Germany, the Warschlacht Museum, where it's theorised, and there's a lot of evidence for it, that was one of the battles of the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. And he was talking about the use of potentially keeping one of your pylons back, not throwing them all, because you have that more distance. And I guess there is still that mindset of keeping distance, but at the same time, it's a different psychological mindset to a Roman legionary soldier.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is always, like, reenactors are always trying to figure out, what's the best weapon, what's the most effective way of using it. And obviously there's a whole sort of YouTube discourse about this kind of thing where they try and test it out. The thing is, ancient sources don't talk about it that way, right? They don't necessarily care about what happens in one-to-one fights, because that's not how you win battles. You win battles by overwhelming the enemy's psychological resistance, essentially, their willingness to stay in that fight. And so it is, in a sense, a lot more important to be scary than to be sort of the most effective or the optimized warrior. And in that sense, I do think that, first the Macedonian pike phalanx, and then later the Roman legionary, they had an edge over many of their enemies because they were in a way terrifying.
Was when we talk about discipline and training, and you mentioned the centurions there, how that is also key to the Roman army working, because part of that is just ingraining in them that, getting close to an enemy, right with your comrades by your side, and not kind of keeping your distance as you would with an ancient Greek hoplite. I might do something controversial then here. I will try and move it, and I'm going to say try this thing, because I've been warned that there's...
Go on.
I'll move it slightly towards me. Only slightly, because I think that's a good point, though.
The next point is armour.
I'll start with this one. I mean, we'll go from top to bottom. We've got an interesting replica of the classic Roman legionary helmet of the early imperial period. Now, of course, it gets a bit more armour added to it and reinforced over time, as I'll talk to. But this one seems, first of all, the Roman legionary helmet wasn't meant to be very heavy. There was discovered in a field in Suffolk the Hawkton helmet, which some believe is actually, although it looks similar to a Roman legionary helmet, they believe it's a gladiator's helmet because it's much heavier and more kind of used for maybe like 20-minute bouts as for a gladiator. But the Roman helmet was not meant to be like overly heavy. You have a lot of protection for the wearer. First of all, mainly made out of iron, maybe a bit of brass around as well. But you have, first of all, let's talk about this rim guard at the front. This is to protect against slashing weapons down, because one of the main areas that an enemy will be trying to attack is the face. So you've got added protection for the rim guard, and also to kind of prevent blows from hitting like the nose and the front of the face, because you don't have that noticeable nose guard as you do with the like classical Greek hoplite. You've got these kind of flappy cheek pieces as well. Once again, that's extra protection against slashing swords and so on that you'll be facing for an Iron Age warrior and so on. You have at the back this big neck guard as well. Once again, the same kind of thing, extra protection against people wanting to slash down on your face. Over time, I don't really see how much you can see on this one. This one looks a bit of kind of decorative design, but there is a bit of contested debate around the beginning of the 2nd century AD, when the Emperor Trajan invades Dacia, which is modern-day Romania, and the Dacians, I'm sure you know, they're renowned for having this double-handed, scythe-like polearm slashing weapon called a falx, and apparently, well, it is contested, but one line of argument is that because these falxes were so devastating when slashing down, to give the legionaries extra equipment, they had a kind of like almost crossbars to the top to kind of help absorb more of those blows. But that is the standard kind of design of a Roman legionary helmet. Further down, you have perhaps the most recognisable part of a Roman legionary's armour, which is the lorica segmentata. Now, I love the lorica segmentata.
As seen in Asterix comics, yeah.
As seen in Asterix comics. At the same time, we don't know what the Romans called it. Lorica segmentata literally means segmented armour, and that's the modern name for it. We know they called chainmail hamata, but we don't know what they called this style. And it seems to have been introduced around the beginning of the 1st century AD or just before that. And that is because some of the earliest archaeological evidence we have, and best archaeological evidence we have for the lorica segmentata, comes from Germany and that site of Kalkriese that I've mentioned, where you have basically 3/4 of this plate armour, of this kind of segmented armour surviving, and archaeologists have been able to garner a lot from that beautiful piece of kit. It's made up of about 40 iron plates, And it's fastened together with kind of copper alloy washers and buckles, leather surviving on it too from that archaeological discovery from Calcreta, which gives people more of a sense of how it was tied together. And the fascinating thing there is not just the outside, it's the inside of the armour as well, where they found these buckles as well to kind of tighten it. And the first version of it, it seems that it is just kind of almost kind of tank top-ish. There's not much shoulder protection. That is added later. There are later examples of lorica segmentata, places like Corbridge and Newstead in Scotland as well, where bits have survived. And it seems that there's more arm protection, and also the outside buckles are removed, and it's just kind of kept inside because they seem to be a bit more, you know, it could easily get knocked off kind of thing and damage the equipment. Something I want to point out: no greaves. No greaves in a Roman legionary soldier of the imperial period. There had greaves earlier on, or at least on one foot, on one leg, but by this time there are no greaves at all there. And a manica, I guess, is the other thing to mention. It seems to be later on that this arm guard is added to their right arm, maybe during the Dacian Wars as well with the falx, a bit of added protection, but we do know that manica is added later on. I think I've gone through everything. That is the armour of a Roman legionary soldier.
There you go.
Over to you.
Yes, so the Greek hoplites, obviously, they have very iconic armour, so it's very easy to sort of talk about it. This is the main item that I think is just widely recognised, the Corinthian helmet, right? This gets introduced, or at least we first see it on vases, and then later we have loads and loads and loads of dedicated examples. So at Olympia, they have shelves and shelves of these, right? Corinthian-style helmets from the Archaic period. The funny thing is that around the time we mostly talk about the Greeks, in the classical period, time of the Persian Wars and after, until the time of Alexander, these things they're still around. Some people might use them, but they've kind of gone out of style. So this kind of thing is an early form of armor, which is very comprehensive, as you can see. It covers the whole face with these long cheek plates. It's got a nose guard. It's got this, at the back, you can see it's got a sort of neck guard here as well that extends quite far down. Yeah. A little bit. It's kind of the same thing as the Roman helmet, just sort of less sticky outy, which is the technical term.
Yeah.
And then basically it covers the whole face, except for initially it doesn't even have ear holes. This one has a few sort of small sort of bits where you can see that the ears might have, so sound would have come in more easily. The idea is that this offers sort of fairly comprehensive protection, but it's often been argued that it's actually quite stifling, it's quite restricting. So you can't hear very much, you can't see very much, it's quite heavy. And you have to imagine that on top of this, they would usually have had a crest or even a double crest, so you'd have quite extensive decoration on top of this. It's made of bronze, not iron, which is one of the big differences between the two. Now, I think reenactors are not necessarily so convinced that this is so restrictive. Like they tend to think that there's, you know, depending on the design, you can actually see and hear what you need to see and hear. But it certainly seems that this iconic shape, it just kind of didn't really stick around for more than a few centuries before other types started to overtake and started to become more common. So for instance, on this image, you actually have this guy wearing an Attic helmet. So this is a different style, which later becomes actually the Roman sort of typical Roman Republican helmet for officers.
It's kind of similar with the cheek pieces there.
Exactly.
You can see,
so it's got the cheek pieces, it's got a more articulated neck guard, it's got a bit of a sort of cap at the front. It still has the crest, but it's sort of a more complex design, but definitely more open-faced, lighter. It leaves more visibility, it leaves more room for the ears. And there are other designs that are even more open-faced, and in particular in the classical period, one helmet that seems to become really popular among the Greeks, so-called pilos helmet, based on a felt cap that may initially have been the cap you wore inside of a bigger helmet, but it becomes just made in bronze, and it's just a cone, it's just a sort of...
It's a conical one, isn't it?
It's just a cap, exactly. Yeah. And so it's very plain, it doesn't have the cheek guards, although sometimes it does, doesn't have a neck guard, it's literally just a sort of cone that you put on your head. Much in the style of like helmets that you might see in World War II or something like that. Just a very basic sort of cap that might protect all the important parts without trying to sort of encase you entirely in metal.
No, and also it's interesting. So you know, this is the classic. You know, when it's the Roman army is a professional army. So yes, although there will be small differences in it, maybe with design and particular design styles, but in regards to the overall look and function, you know, this is kind of a regular that you see for more than 100 years. And actually preceding it, you do have like the Montefertino helmet, which is all like, I'm not going to say it's exactly the same as the pilos, but it's more kind of that idea.
It's just a cap, right? A bowl, like you put the salad bowl on your head. There are a couple of bits sticking out, but otherwise it's very simple.
Yeah, and
shape.
and like earlier in the Mid-Republic as well, you have like more, chainmail is prominent, but also for those who couldn't afford chainmail when they have to buy their own armour, some of them have like a bronze pectoral in the middle, like the classic image of the Hastati soldiers, just like they have that one bit of bronze in the middle, just like aim here please, like don't aim here, which I find really, really interesting, and the shield I think is a bit bigger too. The eye, you mentioned that thing about the ears, which actually I forgot to mention about this one, which is really interesting. Talking to someone at Leeds Armories about it, or experimental archaeologist about it a couple of years ago, and he mentioned when talking about kind of the ears of here, how there's a bit more protection added at the sides, and yes, protection was one of the things. He also said it could be that it was to amplify sound. So if the battlefield is a very noisy place, people are dying, shouting, all that stuff, and that just helps amplify sound. Now I haven't tested it myself, so I can't say, but that's another reason. Visually, I have worn one of these helmets along with the segmentata and the caligae and everything. Like, it does have that, you don't feel restricted at all.
Yeah, it's very open, right?
Yeah,
you can see what you need to see.
And I guess that kind of not having a nose piece at all, I think is kind of countered by having this rim at the front as well for overall slashing. Hopefully as well. Some people said the nose is obviously the most kind of, could potentially be the worst, the least protected parts.
But it's a key difference. So the Corinthian helmet is made out of a single piece of bronze, right? So you have a plate of bronze, and by hammering it slowly into a shape, you essentially create this whole, everything about this, right? There are no parts added. I mean, sometimes there are some cases known with repairs, but otherwise this is just one piece of bronze. And so the difference with that helmet is that for all sorts of reasons, things have been added to the design, but they have actually been added. So you have a little piece where you can attach a crest, you have some hooks where you can sort of, you can wrap it up, you have the cheek pieces, you have the ear pieces, you have the neck guard, all of these things have been added, all these bits get added to it. In that sense, this is a much simpler thing to do, although it's much harder to make in the sense that you have to get it just right. But it's a very simple thing in a sense. It's a very simple design. It's a single piece, can't go wrong. Nothing can happen to it. But that also means that it's very monolithic. The design isn't adapted much. It doesn't change very much over time. So this is why the other helmets presumably became very popular. So you have all these different other types: the Attic, the Illyrian, the Chalcidian, all these different types of helmets that come in over time.
Should we talk briefly about other types of body armor?
Yeah. So on the image you can see a muscle cuirass. So this is the kind of thing that, we have loads of examples of this from southern Italy and from Olympia and other places where these things get dedicated. So you have the muscle cuirass, which is the typical sort of hoplite armor. It consists of two big slabs of bronze, essentially. You clip them at the shoulder and at the sides. You just they fold over the body. Essentially very straight, very, very plain, very simple. Nice. Compared to the Lorica segmentata in particular, with all its little pieces and straps and this
They're
and that.
big on abs, right?
To the abs, you get this. So later on, they start to have this musculature all developed in there. So this is from the sort of 5th century onwards, you start to see these kinds of things. Initially, that design is very plain, it's very schematic. So you have a couple of sort of circles to indicate pectorals. You might have a little sort of arc to indicate the abdomen, but it's very simple. And they will have much more pronounced. So here at the bottom, you can see this actually just stops here at the hip. And the early ones have a sort of pronounced flange there. They have a sort of rim, which is why they're called bell cuirasses, because they tend to have the shape of something resembling a bell. So that is, I hypothesized that because in the early period, people who could afford this were the wealthy, they would travel around on horseback. It's actually quite nice to have that extra sort of lift so that you can move your legs around, so you can raise your legs when you're on horseback. So it's a nice sort of design that suits the elite standard of this kind of armor. Because the thing is, the difference between a Roman legionary, even in the Republican period, there's a requirement, certain types of weaponry or certain types of armor and equipment, you just had to buy it, right? Yeah. That was required. Whereas hoplites, they're just citizens. So they can come to the battle with whatever they can afford. And that also means that there's going to be a lot of variety we've seen in helmets, but also in terms of body armor. Some guys are going to be wearing the bell cuirass or later these nice muscle cuirasses made of bronze, but others don't have that. So the other main design is a cuirass that's called tube and yoke, or this linothorax. So this is a piece of armor that is made out of some organic material, and it's a long, tedious debate over whether this is leather or linen or something else.
Flax or something.
Or flax. Basically, so materials that are flexible but can be layered up to be quite protective. And that can be reinforced with iron sort of scales or little plates and things like that as well. So you see that, for instance, in the Alexander mosaic, which is then it's a beautiful image of that kind of decorated linen cuirass. So that's the kind of armor that you might see as well. It's a very simple design. Again, it's literally a tube and yoke. It's a single piece. So you fold it up and then the flap comes over the top. So basically you have these two sort of strips coming over your shoulder tied in the middle, and that sort of secures the whole thing. Again, it's a much simpler design, but basically what you see in the early designs with Lorica Segmentada are that sort of idea. Like you have just single straps over the shoulder and the rest is a tube, essentially. So that's the other design. But obviously there would have been many hoplites going into battle with none of that because they couldn't afford any of the armor or because they felt the shield by itself would be enough to protect them. And then on this image, you have him also wearing greaves, which are very typical Greek design. They are also single piece bronze. They don't seem to have any lining of any kind, and they don't have hinges. So they just clip around your legs. They're quite soft. Obviously bronze is quite sort of bendable. So you just sort of fit them over your legs. You kind of step into them and fit into them. And again, with greaves, optional. You see the iconic hoplite obviously with all this kit, helmet, cuirass, greaves, but most hoplite warriors probably wouldn't have carried greaves because that is the least sort of essential part of all of this armor. Although most of these warriors would have worn a helmet, only maybe 1 in 10 or some small minority would have actually worn a cuirass, and maybe 3 in 10 or something like that would have worn greaves.
I think that's another thing to highlight, and we'll get more into it as time goes on, but these figures at that time looked very identical, at least when looking from afar, compared to if you're looking at the line of Greek hoplites at the Battle of the Marathon, and they've all got different shield designs and whatever they can.
It's a motley crew, yeah, and in fact obviously all the extra stuff, the decorative stuff, the crests, the feathers, that there's very clear sort of discourse about what you can and cannot do. Some people lavishly decorate themselves and come like peacocks onto the battlefield, whereas others would be just the plainest possible thing, and which you prefer depending on what kind of message you want to broadcast.
It'd be easy to say that this armor is much better, but I don't want to just say that because I talked earlier about how there might be certain adaptations to the armour based on the enemies that they face, and I think that's very, very, very likely. You mentioned the Manica earlier. Is there a similarity with ancient Greek warfare or the Macedonians? I'm thinking maybe if they're fighting the Thracians with their run fire, or if it even existed, or the Persians with all their arrows, do we see adaptations to certain bits of Greek armour with that?
Interestingly, no. I mean, there doesn't seem to be any kind of change to this set of armour in the classical period. So this is kind of steady, and the variation that exists within it is really determined by the status of the warrior. So the elite will get very lavish and very elaborate pieces. Especially in the archaic period, for a brief period, you get these dedications of the super elaborated bronze armor. So you get upper arm pieces, lower arm pieces, foot pieces, ankle pieces, everything else gets added to this. You get this whole kit, which is very beautifully, elaborately decorated. All of that exists just because people want to stand out and want to be even more sort of remarkable on the battlefield. They want to impose, they want to impress. Whereas the average hoplite probably wouldn't have bothered with any of that because they couldn't afford it.
Okay, well, even with all of that, I've still got to move it more towards me, I'm afraid. The arms and the armour.
Fine. If you don't care about decoration.
Tactics, phalanx versus testudo.
Oh, yeah.
So we've got to focus on particular tactics first. Go on, talk about the phalanx.
Yeah, so the phalanx, I mean, is it a tactic? So in the conventional Greek sense, it literally is a tactic. Tactics just means order. Right? You order the troops, you put them in ranks and files. That's a phalanx. It's not a very technical term. It's not a very special tactic or anything like that. It's just ordering all the troops that you have in a line that is a regular order of rank and file. So men are standing in a row, and then there's another row next to them, and that is an orderly formation. We have an image of that. Yeah, we have an image of a nice little hoplite phalanx, or at least a little part of it. Which looks a bit like this. Yeah. Although you'd have to imagine that the rest of the formation would extend directly from it as close as possible, because you don't want any gaps in that line as much as possible. You want to prevent that. But yeah, so they're standing in a grid formation, and that is a phalanx. Although for the Greeks, I mean, this is not a super technical term. They're perfectly happy to call the formation of horsemen a phalanx. Any army that they encounter, if it's in a battle line, that battle line is a phalanx. From the 4th century, when they start using this word. Any battle lines of phalanx. So I think there's a bit of confusion in modern discourse where people think the phalanx is a very particular tactic the Greeks used, when in fact it literally is just their word for a battle line or a battle formation, where earlier on they used taxis for the same concept. However, the confusion comes from the fact that the Macedonian pike phalanx comes to define this idea of a very particular type of formation with these overlapping long pikes. And those men, the men are a part of that, although sometimes they're just called hoplites, because again, the Greeks do not care for technical terms. They just use hoplites for anything. Roman legionary, that's a hoplite. Yeah. But the pikemen are sometimes called phalangites, so the men of the phalanx, and that then makes it as if the word phalanx has a very specific technical application. But in the classical period, or at least in the later classical period, when they start to use the word phalanx, what they mean is literally just a battle line. But this is the typical way in which you use those hoplites. So this is about getting all of the ones who have that similar armor and equipment together to fight in a single formation that has order, which means that you can maneuver them without trying to, or at least as if you can, if you have the time and space to do it, if you have the practice and training to do it, you can maneuver them without losing order, without creating gaps, without falling into confusion. And that is how you maintain the will and the confidence of that line, and that lets you encounter enemies. So in a way, it's just about organization.
I also like the guy at the back who's blowing his horn, right?
So you've got this, I mean,
order,
yeah, so this image, I think, is based on a very fanciful interpretation of one particular vase, which is called the Chigi vase, right? So this is now in a museum in Rome. This is thought to be the earliest depiction of a hoplite phalanx. It isn't. It's centuries out of place, but that doesn't matter. The point is that it has one of these pipers in it. So it has this little guy at the back who seems to be calling for reinforcements, and they clearly put that in the image there, which is very cute. But fundamentally, you're talking about a group of warriors who are in this sort of rank and file. And the thing is, in this image, they've made them 8 deep, so 8 ranks, one behind the other. That is the most commonly cited depth for these formations, and a lot of people have liked to argue that this is the standard depth, and they're always 8 deep. That's clearly not the case. Many other depths are attested. It seems very variable. Sometimes at the beginning of a battle, we're told like every unit had its own depth, they could just decide for themselves. But the point of it is you need to have a number of shields behind one another to prevent breakthrough. And that is what defines these formations. Is they're relatively thin if you look at them on a battlefield scale, but on a local scale they're actually quite deep. You have to fight through a lot of hoplites to break these formations.
So that's the phalanx, and I've got to talk about the testudo. It's the classic image you have of the Roman testudo or the turtle. This idea of the overlapping shields out in front, shields to the side as well. The back probably not covered. One of the best archaeological depictions of it is on Trajan's column, which shows the Emperor Trajan and his soldiers in the Dacian Wars at the turn of the beginning of the 2nd century AD. Although this is the classic image we have of a Roman legionary tactic today, and it's been shown in films like The Eagle, which I think even has a running testudo at the beginning, like running out to try and save some prisoners, and fighting in the open field when there are no archers or anything like that, with shields above. That doesn't seem likely. It doesn't seem, doesn't really make any sense for a Roman legionary to fight like that in the open field, if it's not to protect against arrows. Protecting against arrows is an obvious reason why it could be used at some cases. We don't have many mentions of the testudo being used, but I think one of the main reasons that it is used by Romans is if they're approaching fortifications at certain times. The big question is, once this has got to the walls, the fortification, what does it do next? Some argue that it was to kind of give protection to maybe a sapper or an engineer who would be digging away at the foundations of the wall and have protection from archers shooting down or throwing rocks over whilst they're doing their work. Another interesting one that I see, I think it's a Roman historian who talks about it when they're attacking an enemy town in the 2nd century BC in Greece, in Macedonia. Talks about a case where actually they form this shape but then have it at an angle at the fortification, and people almost run up the shields to get to the wall and fight the people on the walls. So it's almost like a ramp.
It's got very niche applications, right? If you're facing an enemy in the open field, what you want to do, you want to get to them as quickly as you can, right? You want to get into a fight where, especially if you're Roman, you're heavily armored, you're focused on close combat, that's your specialty. You want to get into that situation quickly as you can. You don't want to waste your time trying to protect against arrow fire when that distance that you're covering is much more easily covered just by running into the fight. So I really don't see there's a lot of applications for this unless you are sort of stuck having to plow your way slowly through missile fire, for instance, when you're approaching a fortification, or notoriously at the Battle of Carrhae when they're surrounded by horse archers, and it didn't save them. I mean, they went into testudo formation and it didn't work.
You've got the heavy horsemen then coming in, and if you're being attacked head on, and you're in this turtle testudo formation.
Just bowling pins.
You're at a huge, yeah, exactly. You're in it. And actually, one of the other things, talking to reenactors about that, very easy to fall over. One person falls over, domino effect, it all kind of collapses. No, it's true. When they try to recreate it today, which they do, sometimes successfully, but it's also easy.
Hannibal missed a trick there. It could have...
I think if we're talking just about the testudo and just about the phalanx, I think the phalanx wins that.
I'm happy to say that. I mean, this is the thing about the Greeks, is that they worked out how to create this sort of orderly formation that works to encourage the men themselves, that keeps them in the fight, keeps them secure in the knowledge that their friends have their back, they're at their sides. And that seems to be a battle-winning thing. So getting organized, essentially, as an infantry formation, that's the first step to being effective. Otherwise, you're just a mob.
I will stress, just if we're doing the testudo, though, if we were talking about larger Roman tactics, kind of advancing in silence and kind of that uniform nature in the battering ram, I'd probably say the legionary have the edge. But because we're just doing the testudo,
I don't have to give you that. Yeah.
I'll give you that. There you go. All right. Well, you do it this time.
All right. There we go. There we go. Yeah.
See if you can figure it out.
So I've got training here. I'm going to leave that to you first.
Yes. Well, by the 1st century AD, the Roman army is a professional army, and like the training of a Roman legionary was, I mean, kind of, you know, all day, every day, apart from sleeping. Key parts would be discipline, weapons training naturally as well, strength, stamina, all of those things. Originally, the Roman army wasn't a professional force. I guess you could call it like a bit of a militia, but they're called up, especially in the Roman Republic, like the soldier-farmer idea. Earlier on, spring and summer, you go out fighting, but then you're disbanded and you go back to your farm for the winter. Naturally, as time gets on, you know, with the expansion of Rome, you're fighting abroad, the need for soldiers to fight, you know, season upon season upon season, that changes. You then get the rise of the warlords as well, where the soldiers are less fighting for the Republic and more for the person who they're serving. And ultimately, you get, following the end of the Roman Republic and warlords like Caesar, you get the empire, and then the Roman legionary is there, part of a professional army, and you serve the emperor, and you fight for, well, you're in, and you can't leave for the duration of your service. Give a quick sense of kind of enlisting. We don't know too much about the enlistment process itself, but you can imagine, let's say you're in a town in Italy, you have to be a Roman citizen. There is maybe a recruiting officer there. The pay for a Roman legionary is very, very good. So we know there's a big uptake in Roman legionaries at the beginning of the imperial period. So you'd sign up, seems that you get an allowance to travel to the unit that you sign up to join, and then you have a few months weapons training. Of course, you take an oath to the emperor as well, so you serve the emperor. Weapons training would be heavier equipment than that you ultimately are using, so like heavier wooden swords and shields, but that was basically so that when you're using the real things, you can use them with even more strength, so you become even more of this kind of military man. And let's be fair, the average Roman recruit will be much stronger than the average man of the 21st century, you know, working the fields, you know, that kind of physical labor part of things.
Yeah, I'm going to throw this now. No, seriously, because a lot of my, so my PhD thesis was about sort of Greek tactics, and one of the big questions that I asked myself, that I spent a considerable time studying, was, did the Greeks train? Did Greek hoplites actually train for war? The answer is no. No asterisk, but it's essentially, there is no state organized training anywhere in the Greek world outside Sparta, where it is very limited. So weapons training didn't exist anywhere except privately. I mean, you might choose to train with weapons. Other people would laugh at you and think you're very silly. Spartans didn't do that at all. And the only kind of training that you might need to be effective in battle is like drill, so formation drill, which the Spartans seem to have done sometimes. We don't know when, we have no description of it, but they seem to be capable of maneuvers, which must imply that they have done some work on this. But it may just be that when they go on campaign, they take some time out to do this. But fundamentally, the Greek hoplite, especially in the Persian Wars and classical period, has no training whatsoever. These are militia, they're called up for the moment. Their pay is very, very none until later in the classical period, when they start to sort of introduce military pay, at least for the time being. But that means that these campaigns have to be very short. There's no time to sort of say, okay, we've got all our recruits together, let's train them up and then march out. No, you've got to do it now, because within a few days our food's going to run out. These people have to go home to work on their farms, work in their shops, do whatever they need to survive. You can't keep them in the field for any length of time, so it's got to go straight away, march out, fight the battle, come home. And that is essentially the way in which these militias work. Very large numbers of self-funded troops, essentially. And this broadly remains true throughout the classical period. So it's only towards the end of that you start to get some states like Athens pioneering actual training programs for young men when they reach the age of full adulthood. They take 2 years out to be paid to train. So the state pays them essentially to go through a training program where they learn all sorts of military skills. But within about a decade, this system is scrapped. And when it comes back, it's not funded anymore, which means that only the rich would be able to afford to take 2 years of productivity out of their young lives to spend preparing for war and garrisoning forts and things like that. So basically, they have no training, with the partial exception of the Spartans, who spend a little bit more time, and that gives them an immediate and visible edge over every other Greek. So hoplites don't train. Some individuals may have done some work on this, and there is always the implication that things like group dancing, which Greeks did quite a lot, were quite fanatical about, gives them some indication of, like, moving in unison, moving together, moving to rhythms, following orders, these kind of things. It gives them a little bit of that. And then, of course, the hard work of daily life, but also among the elite, the ideal of spending a lot of time in the gymnasium, athletics, that may have helped to give them some of the fitness required. But this is all it may have, because it's obviously up to the individual. And while we have some Greeks who obviously pride themselves in, getting buff and looking like Greek statues, you also get a lot of sources deriding the rich for being sort of fat and pale and never going outside. So obviously it depends on the individual how much they actually bother.
And the great contrast with the Roman legionary is that it is not voluntary to do this stuff. You signed up, you've got to do this, you've got to do your training. Also, the idea of an idle soldier is something that the Romans hate. So even if they're not fighting, they'll be keeping the peace, building roads, bridges, patrolling, and all of that stuff. And if you slacked in any way, the centurion was watching, keeping an eye, or whoever, and discipline, punishments. There'd be public punishments to make sure you didn't do anything similar. In certain cases, you could be killed. You'd be executed. Which
the Greeks, they technically had laws that allowed generals to do this, but they could never do it, especially in democracies, because if you punish your soldiers are your voters. Yeah. They go back home, they take you to court. Yeah. You can't do it. So you can't get away with it, and you kind of don't enforce the rules.
Well, I think that's a massive win for the Roman army there. Well, let's move on. We can move on. We've got, okay, slightly different. So this is actually completely unused for a Roman legionary anyway. Cavalry. I guess the supporting arm of the army.
Yeah, well, you could call it a supporting arm, depending on if you're the Macedonians, the leading arm.
That's
obviously.
true.
But this is the kind of thing where there's a lot of misconceptions about the way the Greeks saw cavalry. So there's a sense that Greeks are always hoplites and they fight as infantry. And of course, during the Persian Wars, they had no cavalry in the field, right? There's no units of cavalry in these big armies that go and confront the Persians. And so there is this sort of ingrained sense that the Greeks didn't care about cavalry, didn't take it seriously, didn't think it was honorable. Definitely do get some of that in the sources. And that they neglected it. And that the Macedonians kind of taught them, like, look, if you use these guys right, they can be very effective. But that's actually a general move that the Macedonians are sort of a culmination of throughout the classical period, that the Greeks, probably inspired by the Persians, become aware that cavalry can be extremely effective, both in terms of territorial defense, campaign, defense of camps and marching columns, but also in battle. And so as this period goes on, the 5th and 4th centuries BC, cavalry becomes more and more important, and larger parts of these Greek armies become cavalry. And they invest massively in this. Like, the Athenian state is always subsidizing its cavalry. It's not subsidizing hoplites, right? Maybe some rich guy might donate some shields to the state so they can equip some people, but they're paying buckets of silver every year to make sure they have an effective cavalry, and they really keep doing this. Throughout this period, even when in the Peloponnesian War they lose massive numbers of citizens, their citizen population gets sliced in half by this war and the plague and everything else, all the losses. But they keep their cavalry the same size. So they're massively investing in creating a larger and larger cavalry. And so by the time Alexander and Philip march into Greece, at Chaeronea, there are as many cavalry on the Greek side as there are on the Macedonian
Alexander
side.
the Great, yeah, got it, yeah.
Then Alexander the Great, when he crosses into Asia, he's got more Greek cavalry with him than Macedonians. Massive numbers. We're told the Thessalians at one point had 8,000 cavalry. Absolutely enormous given the size of the state. Vast numbers. So Greeks actually really cared about cavalry, really valued it. Heavily encouraged the rich to serve as cavalry, and they were very effective in battle.
I mean, the Romans did kind of have that similar thing at the beginning where, like, the noblemen, like the knights would serve as cavalry in the Republic. But especially when we get to the imperial period, cavalry is not as central as infantry to winning the battles. You know, kind of looking at the legionary soldiers and the auxiliary soldiers from what we hear about. But cavalry is still important. Scouting, reconnaissance, that mobility, protecting the flanks and opposing other cavalry as well. But what we get a sense of as the time goes on is that the Roman citizens themselves don't become cavalry. That kind of part of the army is given to allied units, you know, elsewhere, kind of the auxiliary units, those who when they sign up at the end of their service want to get Roman citizenship. So, I mean, if you look at Hadrian's Wall or something like that, you've got cavalrymen from Spain, I think from France as well, and then you've got the Batavians and Tungrians in Germany and the Netherlands and that area. That's where they're getting their cavalry from, because they think they realise that they're better tradition is as infantry. So I don't want to kind of say that the cavalry is not important to the Roman army. It is important, as I've mentioned, for all the things that I've mentioned. But I do think if you had to put it up against like the Macedonian companions of Alexander the Great, or even his successors, you know, kind of great battles of the Hellenistic period, where cavalry is just, I would argue that's some of the greatest cavalry of ancient history. So I could happily give cavalry to you there.
There we go.
Go on,
take this
yeah.
point. I'll take it. Take it.
Okay, so this is another kind of interesting one, which is not exactly to do with the hoplite of the legionary, it's to do with units around it. It's the navy.
Ah, yeah.
The importance of sea travel and naval warfare. I realised I just picked that one up, and I picked up the last one.
Yeah,
as
you
well.
stole my line. I
I'm
didn't want to
so
say
sorry.
anything, but there we go.
You can't get the professionals these days.
You can talk about the Roman Navy. Yeah, and you're done.
That was the Roman Navy. No, the Roman Navy gets a bad rep because also, I would say so it just gets less attention because once again, the Roman legionary soldier, in movies today you think of the legionary soldier, don't you, and fighting in the armies. But the Navy was incredibly important. The evolution of the Roman Navy is fascinating. Two things that stick out to me straight away, just having I'm not like a Roman naval and maritime kind of expert, but I would think first of all of the First Punic War, where at the beginning it's Rome versus Carthage, this kind of world war of the Western Mediterranean. Like Carthage starts off as the big naval power, and the Romans suffer quite a few defeats, and then ultimately though they learn how to fight and beat the Carthaginians at sea. I think there's a famous case of this thing called the Corvus, which they use at the front, which kind of, it's like kind of a ramp that when their ship clashes into a Carthaginian ship, they kind of nails it down, keeps it in place, and then the Roman soldiers just charge into the Carthaginian ship, and it's almost like turning it from a naval battle into a land battle. Another case I find really interesting is the Battle of Actium, which is kind of the Hellenistic Cleopatra, the Ptolemaic navy, the big ships of Hellenistic Greece against the smaller ships but more maneuverable of Rome, and Agrippa and the Romans win that as well. And then you get like the Romans, I mean, give them credit, they have different naval theatres that they have to maintain and control. It's not just fighting battles. But you think of that stretch of water between Rome and Britain and Gaul. I mean, the Channel, you know, a fearsome piece of water compared to the Mediterranean. And the Romans were like with Caesar, first of all, they really struggle in the Channel. And then they have to develop new types of boats to deal with that deeper water, that more difficult sea.
The Rhine and
conditions.
Danube as well.
The Rhine and the Danube, exactly. So you get like the Classis Britannica, the Classis Germanica, and Roman fleets on these important different routeways, maintaining control against pirates and raiders, but also for the kind of commercial part of it and supplies. You know, the sea is so important and rivers are so important for supplying troops in enemy territory or going beyond the boundaries. So when campaigning in northern Britain or campaigning into Germania, you're going either up the rivers or you're going up the sea as well. So the Navy is important. It's just overshadowed compared to like the Roman legionary army.
Yeah, so I mean, the Battle of Actium, like what were the ships that won that? And we're told they're triremes. These are the ships that made famous by the Greeks. So this is exactly the kind of thing that, you know, you're using this technology to defeat these giant Hellenistic tens, like the tens of Cleopatra, using the exact same technology that the Athenians used to defeat the Persians.
And the tens is just, you've got artillery on your ships, you've got hundreds, if not thousands, of sailors manning them or something like that. It's just bizarre.
It doesn't matter. It's just, but this is to be more precise about it, like the ancient naval warfare is always this sort of tug of war between maneuverability and staying power, essentially. So it's bigger ships that have large crews of deck fighters that try to board, pin down enemy ships, take them over, versus ships that have really trained crews that are very flitty, maneuverable, and that can sort of ram them and disable them that way. So that's always a contest between those two things that Actium obviously really plays out. But throughout history, even within trireme fleets, you have trireme fleets that are more boarding sort of heavy, and there are others that are more sort of maneuver focused. And it just depends on what specialties are. And not necessarily, as some Greek sources like to present it, one is the good one, the modern one, the advanced one, and the other is sort of crude and old-fashioned. It actually seems to go sort of like a seesaw. It goes back and forth a bit. But the Greeks really sort of introduced this. And I mean, the Greeks they see themselves as seafaring people. Plato compares the Greeks sort of sitting around the Mediterranean like frogs around a pond, right? It's a very lovely image. But they are everywhere sort of trying to live near the sea and then to occupy the sea and to trade and travel and also, of course, wage war. And so they develop fleets fairly early on. They adopt the trireme, which may be a Greek invention, but more likely something invented in Phoenicia. They adopt it fairly early on.
Which is Lebanon, by the way. So that's Levant, yeah.
Eastern Mediterranean, yeah. And they build very large fleets, which when the Persians come in, they take sort of half of those and use them for their own purposes, but the other half is in mainland Greece and the islands. And they become sort of the great rulers of the sea, especially under the Athenians. This is the greatest fleet that exists on the Mediterranean for a considerable amount of time. And even the Macedonians, who are absolutely dominant on land and find it relatively easy to topple over Greek states one after the other through diplomacy and warfare, on the sea, they're terrified of the Athenians. They don't have a fleet to match them until the 320s. After Alexander is dead, they actually have to fight the Athenians on the sea. The Athenians launch a massive fleet. Battle of Amorgos happens, and in one day it's all over. But at that point, Athens has more ships than it ever had before, right? They have enormous numbers of hulls in the dockyards. By then they have 4s and 5s, so they have bigger ships. They're really developing, pushing that envelope of naval warfare. Huge dockyards, huge dry docks, facilities. Ancient Athens is absolutely the hub of naval warfare for centuries.
This is difficult for me because primarily I'm a Hellenistic kind of focus after Alexander the Great's death, and when you get those bigger ships. But I think when looking at the longevity of certain designs like the trireme, kind of how far and wide they spread across the Mediterranean, I mean, that's a point for them. Conversely, you can look at how the Romans, they adapt, they get better at it. And then how actually, the maritime part is so important to maintaining their empire. With the rivers and the seas, with Rome, Britain and Gaul. I mean, Roman legionary soldiers are taught to swim. It seems to be part of their training is that they are taught at least a level of swimming. I potentially say they cancel each other out, but I mean, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, it's obviously the Romans are so successful both on land and on sea that in the end the Mediterranean becomes a private lake for them.
Mare
I mean, they call it
Nostrum,
exactly, our sea, which the Greeks obviously never achieved despite their huge spread, because they eventually are challenged both by states of their own. There's always contest between them, but also by the Persians who keep them in check for
okay, maybe I was being too nice then. Okay,
so,
I'll move it.
No. I mean, I think that's fair. I think that's I have leadership here, which is, I think, a more contestable thing. I mean, leadership is something that has so many different forms, right? You have obviously these really famous leaders of Greek armies. You have during the Persian Wars, you have Leonidas and then Pausanias and Aristides at the Battle of Plataea. You have great figures like the Theban general Epaminondas, who is sometimes was considered by the Romans, in fact, the greatest Greek who ever lived, because he defeated the Spartans and he liberated Messenia and he changed the map of the Peloponnese in the Greek world. So you have a lot of figures who had quite a lot of presence in the minds of the Greeks themselves and later authors as well in antiquity. One that I personally find very interesting is an Athenian commander called Iphicrates, who never had any great battles, any great victories in sort of pitched engagements, but who later in these collections, when these Roman authors start to collect like stratagems, tricks, deceit and ways in which you can sort of get one over on the enemy, there's this long collection of different things and all these different leaders who have like 1 or 2 examples of things that they did they're famous for. Alexander has like 30 or something. Iphicrates stands way at the top with 61 different stratagems credited to him. He is the sort of mischievous Loki figure of ancient warfare. And that's a Greek hoplite commander, at least some of the time. So you have leadership in different ways, right? These are not world-conquering figures until you get to Alexander. These are not the kind of Roman leaders who've like, I subjected Britain, you know, you hardly get any of that. But they are people who really live in their minds, really stick with them as people who did something right.
Yeah, my account would just be Julius Caesar, but I don't think it's a bit more
complicated
than that. No, it's definitely
well,
much more
he wept
complicated.
because he was not like Alexander.
Well, no,
right?
exactly.
He wasn't good enough.
Exactly. And actually, when you were saying that, I was actually thinking with Roman leadership, and I mentioned it earlier. Actually, the bigger names aren't as interesting to me as the whole kind of centurion, the importance of the centurion, the lower officers who have the direct communication with the legionary soldiers. As I said earlier, and Ben Kane said to me, kind of the equivalent of like what they say, you do, and you follow orders. And if you don't follow those orders, you will be disciplined, and you will be publicly disciplined as well. And that kind of gets trained into you. But I would say with leadership, one of the key, I mean, it is one of the cores, the success of the Roman legionary soldier, but it is the centurion. It is those people with direct communications with the soldiers, and also the ability to relay orders from higher up in the strategy. They won't be at the forefront, you know, fighting. I mean, they will be very near, but they'll have their iconic vine stick. They'll have their helmet, but with the big crest, so they are visible. So they are a target at the same time, but that also does give you a bit of, I would argue, as a legionary soldier, a bit of confidence that your leaders are there, at least your leaders are there fighting with you, at the lower rank at least. And you know, kind of that, it is that core of the successful legionary soldier.
Yeah, no, and this is, I think, a very important thing that kind of restrains Greek leadership almost with these hoplite armies. So as I've said, they don't really have training; they're just called up for the moment. And so, in order to inspire them, in order to make them feel that they're there for a reason, they should commit to the cause. A lot of these hoplite commanders would choose to lead from the front, right? They would be right there with their guys. They would say, "I will take the same risks that I'm asking you to take, and that's how I inspire you." But obviously, that means you're right at the front of the phalanx, you know, the formation. It's very difficult for you to keep an overview, and it's very difficult for you to give or transmit orders. And so what ends up happening is their battle plans have to be very simple, everything agreed in advance, because once the fighting starts, I mean, the general's busy staying alive, you know, he's got no time for clever plans. And so a lot of that leadership is essentially leading by example. That's the model they go with, and that really restricts them in their options. There is the rival kind of model, which is sort of leading from behind, being the sort of battle master. But for the Greeks, that's often just impossible, because if you're standing at the back, then these guys are going to say, well, why am I running the risk? You know, if you don't even. And Alexander the Great actually sort of takes that to the nth degree. Like, his whole leadership style, although he has all these nice battle plans, is to be the first into the enemy, you know, to lead his cavalry in person, to be visible, to be seen doing that. With the downside, obviously, a lot of these guys just keep dying in battle.
Yeah, and so many of his commanders die, and he's just very lucky at the end of the day. But
exactly.
He has to have the utmost confidence in his commanders, who are basically these mini Alexander figures,
right?
To see through the parts of their plan. But I think that also comes back to the whole thing of a professional army idea. It's like, it's not this idea, oh, why am I fighting if they're staying at the back? It's the fact you've signed up, you're there for a set number of years. You also have your main officer watching nearby, or kind of keeping an eye for acts of valor or acts of cowardice in the middle of battle. So you don't actually think about that person at the back who's actually dictating battle strategies. It's a whole different thing. But I think that's also a kind of success. But it's a different style. As a Greek warfare, I think there is more leading from the front than with Romans generally. And now there are differences to that, by saying. Which just brings to the point, which is better.
Which is better. Well, I mean, this is what I'm saying. Like, these Greek commanders keep dying. There are actually very few Roman or Greek generals that we know of for more than one victory, which is kind of a striking thing. It's not because they're dropping like flies. It's also partly because it's not their job, right? They get elected or they get put in these positions, and because battles are fairly rare. But generally, I think this leadership style has some pretty serious flaws, which the Greeks are fairly aware of. And so it becomes difficult for them to really develop the art of leadership. And it's very interesting to me that when Xenophon thinks of the ideal leader, his example, the figure that he puts the vessel that he pours that into, is Cyrus the Great, a Persian.
Okay. Yeah.
That's his example of what a leader should be, because presumably he has the legitimacy. He doesn't have to worry so much about, are people going to elect him general again or anything like that. He just is. He's the king.
Oh, that's true. When you think of commanders, like ancient Greek commanders, you might think of Leonidas at 300, dies. Epaminondas, as you said, will die. Alexander the Great won't die in battle, but he does die young anyway.
Come on, he should have.
Anyway, he should have died, absolutely. But many of the big Roman generals, they don't die on the battlefield. Usually don't, which is interesting. So I probably would give that to the Romans. But I'm going to move
Give it to the Romans. Fine.
Yeah, there we go. It's almost like someone's been reading the ancient Roman historian Livy. Who would win?
I feel like we know that one.
Shall I? I know. It does. I'll clarify when I said Livy there, because that's, Roman historian Livy, who is a writer, is it the 1st century BC? I think it's around that time, isn't he? And he talks about the Punic Wars, he talks about the wars against the Macedonians, he always puts a lovely twist on it for the pro-Roman agenda. But part of it is this idea of what if Alexander the Great had marched west rather than east and had met the Romans in southern Italy. Now, of course, it's not the classical Greek hoplite, but I think Alexander's allies would have had hoplites in them. With them, and he comes to the conclusion that the Romans would have won, unsurprisingly for Livy.
Did he now? Yeah,
yes.
Yeah, yeah.
but that was just a sideshow from what we're talking about. Who would win?
But I mean, it's fairly obvious. I mean, these clashes did happen, and the Greeks never managed to do anything very much to the Romans. It's almost frustrating. We would love to know more detail.
Were there many actually Roman legionary versus classic, like Greek hoplite? I mean, I think of Macedonian phalanx, kind of thing like that, and Pyrrhus.
This is the problem. The Greek hoplite somewhat disappears from our sources, partly because the focus of these grand historical narratives, your Polybius, your Livy, they focus much more on the big states, right? And the big states will field pikemen, and sometimes sort of imitation legionaries, which they start to introduce, their swordsmen of their own. And so their focus is very heavily on those troops, and if they're looking for something a little bit sort of lighter, more flexible, they'll field from the 3rd century BC onward, they'll field these thureophoroi, right? These sort of thureos bearers, which are essentially sort of Celtic-inspired, rearmed infantry. And so the hoplite doesn't really get much of a look in. We know that iconographically they're still represented every now and then. You still find them everywhere. So people may still have been armed like that, or they may have switched over to carrying the thureos, this new sort of oval shield, and a different kind of weaponry. But the problem is we just don't really know. But the big decisive battle, when Sulla goes to sort of sort things out in Greece in the 80s BC, which is like the final gasp of the final attempt of the Greeks to seize independence, and there's this huge battle in which supposedly Sulla is massively outnumbered, but he still wins anyway. And it's not very well explained how that happened. And it can be very frustrating if you're sort of instinctively rooting for the Greeks. It's like, but they had all these assets, all these numbers. They had him, they had his back against the wall. But how could they lose? But it just seems like, in a lot of ways, when it comes down to the nitty gritty of a pitched battle, Roman professionalism, Roman discipline really has the edge.
I think so, and it's interesting when you look at some cases where, earlier on when the phalanxes beat the legion, with Pyrrhus, it's on a flat plain. But whenever the phalanx was on more unruly, rough ground, the Romans can get round. The centurions, once again, go back to centurions, they have a lot of it seems to have got a bit of independence as well. So if they see a gap in the enemy line, they move their troops to it.
So kinos kephalae, right, where they sort of split off and take the phalanx in the flank.
Yeah, but the thing is just like, well, actually, if you think, a hoplite phalanx was best suited for flat ground, well, the Roman legionary force is also best suited for flat ground as well. So
it's a bit of a silly thing. The pike phalanx is sort of over-specialized. Like, it really doesn't function very well off any kind of flat ground. So that's actually difficult. But it's, obviously any army is best suited to flat ground. And in fact, ancient infantry tends to recognize flat ground as cavalry territory. So they're in danger there. So you even have Macedonian pike phalanxes retreating into the hills when there's too many Thessalian cavalry around. So they know their place, right? So we have to think a little bit more flexibly about this, and also a little bit more in terms of contingency, like what's actually happening on the ground. Because it seems like a lot of these big battles, the Romans defeat the pike phalanx. It's not out of sort of inherent mechanical features. It's because centurions on the spot took the right decisions, and the phalanx proved less flexible to essentially defend against that.
So what we've just decided then is that we're just going to move it all the way down here.
Right, go on. Yeah, that is unfortunately that is historically accurate. Yeah.
It's still difficult. We could talk about the reach of the. Well, I think
the arrow's given up.
Divine judgment there. Roel, this has been very fun.
Absolutely.
They did want us to wear the helmets.
Fair enough. We want to do that.
Yes,
put these
let's
on.
put the helmets on.
It's this, see if it fits my oversized head. Nope. I got to have some padding in here. That's the thing.
You need to hold it up.
Yeah.
You need to hold it up a bit. Mine's not much bigger.
That's actually.
That was the main problem with the Greek helmet.
You just can't see
They're
anything.
all just too big.
Just do an outro. But thanks for putting that on.
Well, there you go. Well, thank you very much. I mean, that was a fun discussion. See, we're friends, really. You know.
Just don't invade Greece again.
But yes, if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to the History Hit YouTube channel. It really helps us as we continue making these videos. And yeah, leave us a comment. Let us know what units you'd like us to cover next and whether you agree or disagree with our decisions. Until next episode.